In kitchens where no one counted calories or read labels, people stayed on their feet longer. They moved through their days with a kind of stamina that wasn't talked about. It was just expected, built quietly from what showed up at the table. Bone broth simmered on stoves for hours, sometimes days, filling homes with a smell that meant someone was taking care. Grandmothers kept pots going through winter, adding scraps of bone and vegetable ends that would have been thrown away in later years. People drank it plain, used it to cook rice, or served it as the base for nearly everything that mattered. It wasn't called medicine, but it showed up in homes where people expected to keep working, to keep moving, to stay useful well into older age. The broth carried something that couldn't be seen but could be felt, a steadiness that held people together from the inside. And it didn't stop there. Oatmeal arrived at breakfast tables in houses where the day started early and demanded endurance. It was cooked slow, sometimes overnight on wood stoves, and served plain or with a spoon of molasses stirred through. Farmhands ate it before heading into fields. Factory workers ate it in dim morning kitchens before long shifts. No one spoke about what it did, but people who ate it regularly seemed to carry a kind of steady energy that lasted. It wasn't flashy fuel. It was the kind that kept you going without thinking about it, that let you work through morning without your body asking for more. Oatmeal was something you could count on, and in homes where reliability mattered more than variety, that counted for everything. There was another food, just as familiar, just as quietly powerful. Eggs sat on counters in bowls, gathered from backyard coops or bought by the dozen from neighbors. They showed up scrambled in cast iron, fried in butter, or boiled and packed into lunch pails. People ate them because they were there, because they were cheap, because they filled you up and didn't leave you hungry an hour later. In households where physical work defined the day, eggs were something you ate without ceremony. They didn't need explanation or dressing up, just heat and a little fat. What they offered was simple: the ability to rebuild after a long day, to wake up without aching as much, to keep your strength when your body was being asked for more than it wanted to give. And eggs were never alone in this quiet work. Sardines came in small tins with keys that peeled back metal lids, and they smelled like the sea even if you were nowhere near it. Dock workers ate them, coal miners ate them, people in tenement kitchens ate them straight from the can with crackers or bread. They were inexpensive, they didn't spoil, and they carried a density that other foods didn't. Sardines weren't elegant, but they were efficient. Something about them seemed to shore up bones and keep joints from complaining as loudly. In communities where people worked with their hands and bodies, until those hands and bodies wore down, sardines were a small, oily insurance policy. They weren't celebrated, but they were respected in the way practical things often are. But this was only part of a much larger rhythm. Liver appeared on dinner plates in homes where nothing was wasted and where strength was something you had to maintain, not something you assumed would last. It was fried with onions, baked into pâtés, or served alongside potatoes and greens. Children were told to eat it without complaint, and adults ate it because their parents had, and because people who worked hard seemed to need it. Liver had a taste that took getting used to, but it also had a reputation. People who ate it regularly didn't tire as easily, didn't pale as quickly, didn't seem to fade the way others did. It wasn't about preference. It was about what the body required when it was being asked to do more than sit still. And liver was far from the only food that carried that kind of quiet authority. Beans filled jars and pantries and simmered in pots that sat on stoves for hours, softening into something that could stretch a meal and fill a table. They were cheap, they kept forever, and they appeared in nearly every culture's version of everyday eating. Pinto beans, navy beans, black beans, lima beans, each region had its own, and each family had a way of preparing them that had been passed down without much discussion. Beans were the backbone of meals in homes where people couldn't afford to buy meat every day, and yet those same people often stayed strong well into age. There was something in the steadiness of beans, in the way they grounded a meal and kept hunger at bay for hours, that seemed to support the kind of endurance that mattered when life required you to keep moving. There was another staple, just as humble, just as central. Cornbread came out of ovens and cast iron skillets, golden and crumbling at the edges, and it showed up beside nearly everything: greens, beans, stews, soups. It was made with cornmeal buttermilk, sometimes a little bacon grease, and it didn't need much else. In southern kitchens and Appalachian homes, cornbread wasn't a side dish. It was expected, as much a part of the meal as the plate itself. People who ate it regularly seemed to carry a kind of groundedness, a physical steadiness that came from food that didn't try to be more than it was. Cornbread filled you without weighing you down, and in homes where people worked from dawn until dusk, that balance mattered more than anyone thought to say out loud. And it wasn't the only food that occupied that space. Cottage cheese sat in bowls on kitchen tables, plain and unassuming, often eaten with a spoon as a quick meal or stirred into other dishes to stretch them further. It was something older people seemed to eat more often, especially those who wanted to stay light on their feet but still needed substance. Cottage cheese didn't announce itself, but it quietly supported muscle and bone in ways that only became clear over time. In homes where independence meant being able to move without assistance, to carry your own weight, to not become a burden, cottage cheese was a small daily practice. It wasn't glamorous, but it worked, and in the arithmetic of aging, that was enough. There was something else, just as ordinary, just as effective. Apples hung in root cellars and sat in bowls on counters, available almost year-round in some form, fresh in fall, dried in winter, preserved in jars as applesauce. People ate them whole, but baked them with cinnamon, or sliced them into oatmeal. Apples were so common they barely registered as noteworthy, and yet homes where apples appeared regularly seemed to be homes where digestion ran smoothly, where energy stayed even, where people didn't complain as much about their bodies slowing down. There was a cleanness to apples, a way they seemed to keep things moving inside without drama or discomfort. In an era when doctors were expensive and far away, that kind of regularity mattered more than it might now. And apples weren't the only root vegetable that carried weight in everyday kitchens. Sweet potatoes roasted in coals, baked in ovens, or boiled and mashed into something warm and filling. They showed up in sharecropper kitchens and on tables where money was tight, but expectations for hard work were not. Sweet potatoes were cheap, they stored well, and they had a sweetness that didn't require sugar to feel like comfort. People who ate them seemed to sustain energy longer, to recover from physical labor without falling apart. In communities where strength wasn't optional, where you either kept up or you didn't eat, sweet potatoes became a kind of quiet fuel. They weren't fancy, but they were dependable, and dependability in food translated to dependability in body. There was another vegetable, tougher and less sweet, that played a similar role. Cabbage grew in gardens and kept through winter and cold storage, available when almost nothing else was. It was boiled, fried, fermented into sauerkraut, or shredded into slaws. Cabbage didn't taste like much on its own, but it filled plates and stomachs in homes where volume mattered as much as flavor. People in Eastern European immigrant communities ate it daily. Irish families built meals around it. It was food for people who needed to stay strong on very little, and somehow it worked. Cabbage seemed to support the body's ability to resist illness, to stay upright when others were falling sick, to keep moving when everything else felt like it was shutting down. And cabbage had close relatives that shared its resilience. Collard greens simmered in pots with ham hocks or fatbacks, slow cooked until tender, and served with cornbread to soak up the liquid left behind. They were a staple in southern black kitchens, in homes where people worked land they didn't own and needed food that could sustain them through long, back-breaking days. Collard greens weren't delicate, and they weren't meant to be. They were sturdy, they required chewing, and they delivered something the body seemed to recognize as necessary. People who grew up eating collards regularly often had grandparents and great-grandparents who stayed active far longer than seemed reasonable given the hardness of their lives. The greens didn't make life easier, but they seemed to make endurance possible. There was another root vegetable, similarly tough, similarly essential. Turnips appeared in stews, roasted alongside meat, or mashed like potatoes in homes where potatoes were too expensive or unavailable. They had a sharpness that mellowed with cooking, and they kept well in root cellars through months when nothing else grew. Turnips were food for people who couldn't afford to be particular, and yet they carried a substance that other vegetables didn't. In rural kitchens, where winter meant eating what you'd stored or going without, turnips showed up again. And again, they weren't beloved, but they were respected for what they did, filling bellies, supporting bones, keeping bodies functional when there wasn't much else to work with. And they weren't the only vegetable that fit that description. Carrots came from gardens and markets, cheap and plentiful, and they appeared in nearly every form: raw, roasted, boiled, baked into cakes when sugar was scarce. People ate them because they were there, because they added color to a plate, because children would sometimes eat them when they wouldn't eat anything else. Carrots had a sweetness that felt natural, not cloying, and they seemed to do something quietly useful for eyes and skin and overall vitality. In homes where people worked outdoors, where vision mattered for safety and survival, carrots were a small daily insurance. They weren't treated as special, but they were treated as necessary, and that distinction meant everything. There was another staple, even more universal, even more central. Potatoes filled plates in Irish households, Polish kitchens, Appalachian tables, and almost everywhere else people needed to eat cheaply and stay full. They were boiled, mashed, fried, baked, or roasted, and they stretched meals in ways that few other foods could. Potatoes were survival food, but they were also strength food. They gave people the ability to work long hours without collapsing, to recover overnight and do it again the next day. In communities where famine had taught hard lessons about what happens when staple foods fail, potatoes were taken seriously. They weren't exciting, but they were reliable, and in the calculus of daily survival, reliability beat excitement every time. And potatoes often shared the plate with another staple just as fundamental. Rice sat in sacks in kitchens across the South, in Chinatowns, in Caribbean communities, in homes where it was cooked daily and eaten without comment. It was boiled plain, fried with vegetables, or served under stews and sauces that needed something to soak into. Rice was cheap, it kept forever, and it could be prepared by anyone with a pot and water. In homes where people worked in fields or factories and came home too tired to cook anything complicated, rice was the foundation. It didn't try to be more than it was, but it gave people the fuel to keep going, the steadiness to not burn out before the day was done. And rice was often accompanied by something warm and restorative. Chicken soup simmered in pots when someone was sick, when someone was tired, when someone just needed to feel taken care of. It was made from bones and scraps and whatever vegetables were on hand, and it filled the house with a smell that felt like safety. Chicken soup wasn't reserved for illness. It appeared at regular meals, especially in homes where older people lived and where keeping strength up was a daily concern. There was something in the warmth of it, in the way it went down easy and settled without heaviness that seemed to restore something that other foods didn't touch. People who ate chicken soup regularly didn't just feel comforted, they seemed to recover faster, to stay healthier, to hold on to their independence longer. There was another cultured food, tangy and old-fashioned, that worked in similar ways. Buttermilk came in glass bottles or churns, thick and sour, and people drank it plain or used it in baking. It was a byproduct of butter making, something that would have been wasted if people hadn't figured out it was useful. In rural communities and farming families, buttermilk showed up at lunch tables and evening meals, often drunk alongside cornbread or biscuits. It had a sharpness that took getting used to, but people who drank it seemed to digest better, to maintain a kind of gut steadiness that kept other systems running smoothly. Buttermilk wasn't trendy, but it was traditional, and in homes where tradition meant survival, that carried weight. And buttermilk had a close relative, similarly cultured, similarly valued. Yogurt appeared in immigrant kitchens, Greek, Middle Eastern, Eastern European, and it was eaten plain, mixed with honey, or used in cooking. It was something grandmothers made at home, something that required patience and attention, but didn't require much else. Yogurt wasn't widely popular in American households until much later, but in the communities that knew it, it was treated as essential. People who ate yogurt regularly seemed to age differently. Less digestive complaint, less fragility, more ability to keep moving without their bodies protesting. It wasn't magic, but it was consistent, and consistency in food often translated to consistency in health. There was another pantry staple, creamy and protein dense, that served a similar purpose. Peanut butter sat in jars in nearly every household, spread on bread, stirred into oatmeal, or eaten straight from the spoon when hunger struck and nothing else was ready. It was cheap, it didn't spoil, and it filled you up fast. Peanut butter showed up in lunch pails, in after-school snacks, in late-night kitchens when someone needed something substantial without effort. People who ate it regularly seemed to maintain muscle better, to not lose weight as easily during hard times, to have a reserve of energy that carried them through long stretches without food. Peanut butter wasn't fancy, but it was powerful in its simplicity, and in homes where simplicity was all you could afford, that mattered. There was another thick, dark staple that carried a different kind of strength. Molasses came in jars and tins, dark and sticky, and it was stirred into oatmeal, baked into cookies, or mixed with warm water and drunk as a tonic. It had a strong, almost medicinal taste, but people didn't eat it for pleasure. They ate it because their mothers and grandmothers told them to, because it was believed to keep blood strong and energy steady. In homes where people worked physically demanding jobs, molasses was a small daily ritual. It wasn't explained in scientific terms, but people who took it regularly seemed to tire less easily, to hold up better under strain, to not fade as winter wore on. Molasses was old-fashioned even then, but it stayed in kitchens because it worked. And molasses often accompanied another hearty, wholesome staple. Whole grain bread came from bakeries or home ovens, dense and dark, nothing like the soft white bread that would come later. It was made with wheat, rye, or other grains that hadn't been stripped down to nothing, and it had a heaviness that meant a single slice could carry you for hours. People ate it with butter, with cheese, with soup, or plain. Whole grain bread was food for people who needed to work, who needed to stay on their feet, who couldn't afford to run out of energy halfway through the day. It wasn't light or fluffy, but it was sustaining, and in homes where sustenance was the whole point of eating, that made it irreplaceable. There were also everyday ingredients, sharp and pungent, that appeared in nearly every savory dish. Onions hung in braids from rafters or sat in baskets in cool pantries, and they showed up in nearly every meal that required cooking. They were cheap, they kept well, and they added depth to food that would have been bland without them. Onions weren't eaten for health. They were eaten because they made everything else taste better. But people who cooked with onions daily seemed to stay healthier, to fight off illness more easily, to not succumb as quickly when sickness moved through a household. In kitchens where prevention was cheaper than cure, onions were a quiet form of protection and onions rarely appeared without their sharper, more pungent companion. Garlic hung in kitchens alongside onions, used in smaller amounts, but with just as much regularity. It was chopped into stews, rubbed on bread, or cooked into sauces that formed the base of family meals. Garlic had a reputation. People believed it kept sickness away, that it strengthened the body, that it was something you ate when you wanted to stay well. In Italian, Jewish, and Eastern European households, garlic wasn't optional. It was embedded in the food culture, and people who grew up eating it seemed to carry a resilience that was hard to pin down but easy to notice. Garlic didn't announce what it did, but it did it anyway. There were also gentler remedies, steeped and sipped, that played their own role. Herbal teas were brewed in teapots and drunk throughout the day. Chamomile, mint, ginger, dandelion, whatever grew nearby or could be dried and stored. They weren't medicine in the clinical sense, but they were treated as something more than just a drink. People drank herbal teas to settle their stomachs, to calm their nerves, to warm themselves, to ease aches that came with age and work. In homes where doctors were far away or too expensive, herbal teas were a first line of care. They didn't cure everything, but they kept small problems from becoming big ones, and they allowed people to manage their own bodies with confidence. And teas often accompanied larger, heartier meals that anchored the day. Homemade stews bubbled in pots on stoves, made from whatever was on hand. Meat scraps, bones, root vegetables, beans, grains. Stews were food for people who needed one pot to feed many mouths, who needed meals that could sit on the stove and be eaten throughout the day as people came and went. They were thick, they were filling, and they carried a warmth that went beyond temperature. Stews were where leftover became abundance, where scarcity turned into sufficiency. People who ate stews regularly seemed to stay grounded, to maintain strength without needing variety or complexity. Stews were humble, but they were enough, and in many homes, enough was everything. There was another legume, smaller and quicker cooking, that appeared just as often. Lentils cooked faster than beans and showed up in soups, stews, or side dishes in households where time and fuel were limited. They were eaten in Indian communities, Middle Eastern families, and by anyone who needed protein without the cost or time of meat. Lentils didn't have the glamour of meat or the comfort of bread, but they had a steadiness that people came to rely on. They filled you up, they kept you going, and they didn't ask for much in return. In homes where people worked long hours and needed food that could keep up, lentils were a quiet ally, and lentils often shared the table with another ancient grain. Barley appeared in soups and stews, cooked into porridge, or used in place of rice when rice wasn't available. It was food from an older time, something that felt almost forgotten even as it sat on tables. Barley had a chewiness that made meals feel more substantial, and it seemed to sustain energy in a way that lighter grains didn't. People who ate barley regularly, especially older, but people often stayed active longer, kept their strength, maintained a kind of physical resilience resilience that outlasted their peers. Barley wasn't fashionable, but it was functional, and in the quiet hierarchy of foods that kept people going, that was what mattered. There was also fresh protein, simple and available, that appeared in various forms. Fish came fresh from rivers, lakes, or oceans, or it came canned in tins when fresh wasn't possible. It was fried, baked, grilled, or poached, and it showed up in coastal communities, in inland towns near waterways, and in pantries where canned salmon or mackerel sat alongside the sardines. Fish was lighter than meat, but no less sustaining, and people who ate it regularly seemed to move with more ease, to have joints that didn't complain as loudly, to age without the stiffness that plagued others. Fish wasn't a luxury, it was available, it was affordable, and it did something for the body that other proteins didn't quite manage. And when fresh, food wasn't available, there was something preserved, something sweet, something saved. Seasonal fruit preserves lined pantry shelves in jars sealed with wax or metal lids, holding the taste of summer through winter months when nothing fresh grew. Strawberry, peach, blackberry, apple, whatever fruited in abundance got preserved, and it was spooned onto bread, stirred into oatmeal, or eaten straight when something sweet was needed. Preserves weren't just about flavor, they were about continuation, about making sure the body had access to something bright and vital even in the darkest months. People who ate preserves regularly seemed to hold on to a lightness, a resistance to the dreariness that winter could bring. Preserves were small jars of persistence, and in homes where persistence was survival, they were never taken lightly. These foods didn't need to be discovered, they were already there, quietly doing what they'd always done. If you found something here worth remembering, subscribe, there's more where this came from.